So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's edition of Conversations from the Trenches. And today, as most of you who have read my post or since yesterday will know, we are talking about a topic that is very, very crucial to women's rights movements and women's empowerment. And that is the ability and the rights of the women to own land and property and to exercise that right? So, this topic, I notice, is not a very often spoken about topic in the mainstream. There are a lot of conversations about financial literacy of women. There is a lot of conversation about women in employment. There's a lot of conversation about why women must be financially independent. Interestingly and ironically, we do not have conversations about women owning high value assets like land, which appreciates over time. Now, this is really ironic because if we really have to speak about women's empowerment, we should be talking about ownership of assets, which can be game changers for women to stand up and be their own persons. So, I have with me today a very special guest who I think I'm very, very privileged and honored to have. I have with me Shipra Deo, who is the Director of Women's Land Rights in India for Landesa. Shipra, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm extremely grateful and honored that you're here today with us.
Thank you so much, Rekha. It's my privilege to have a conversation with you.
A little background about Shipra, because I recognize that land rights is not an often talked about topic, and therefore we may not know the people who are, playing such crucial roles in this area. Shipra is a very passionate advocate of strong and clear land rights for women. In fact, Shipra believes that land rights is a very powerful tool for us to correct the existing gender inequalities. Shipra has almost 20 plus years of experience of working in the grassroots, and she has worked with women in very remote areas and helping them build their collectives to raise consciousness and their voices. Shipra's experience is national and international. She has worked with international agencies like the UNDP, USAID, BMGF, as well as the governments at center and state. She has led projects, development projects, which are which are involved in complex programs. Which has steered progressive changes in very challenging contexts. Shipra is also an extremely vocal advocate. She's a researcher. She's a writer. She blogs regularly, and she advocates for policy changes for land rights for all women. So, as you can see, we're very lucky to have someone like Shipra here to talk to us. I can see people are already logging into the conversation. I'm going to welcome everybody who's logging in and watching to say hello, to ask your questions, to weigh in as this conversation goes on. Because as Shipra keeps telling me, this is a conversation. The ownership of land, the ownership of property is a conversation for all women, and we need all our voices here. So, Shipra, to start off, can I invite you to tell us a little bit more about the work you do in the area of women and land rights?
Of course, Rekha. Um, so, we as Landesa see land and secure rights to land as a powerful tool to come out of poverty and to improve lives. So if one has secure rights to land, it encourages people to make productivity enhancing investments in the land, which
Hmm,
increases yields, increases income, and increases wealth further. It
hmm,
also encourages people to adopt more of environment friendly practices and
yeah.
also reduces conflicts and crime. And especially, I think when it comes to women owning a high value asset such as land or any other form of property, I think a piece of land helps build a woman's perception of her own self,
Hmm,
first of all. And
hmm,
then it offers her a firm foundation, sort of, to build a life of dignity and also of resilience.
yeah.
Several studies have shown that if women have stronger rights to land, they are less willing to endure violent relationships. So
Yeah.
we as Landesa believe that to fully tap to the transformative power of land, men and women must hold it equally. So across the globe, wherever we work with the governments, we work with the civil society, and we also work with the communities to make the entire land ecosystem equitable and also at the same time gender responsive. We
Mm,
support governments as well as other institutions in institutionalizing gender equal framework in land related programs
mm,
and making land related administration inclusive, more progressive, gender
yeah.
responsive.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things with which we as Landis are engaged in
Right.
various countries, including India.
Right. Thanks for sharing that, Shipra. Something, what you talked about, how a piece of land can give women dignity and more than anything else, safety from violence. That is something that resonates very, very deeply with me because my mother was in an abusive marriage for almost 18 to 19 years. And the only reason she did not work and earn an income, but because she owned the land, she had the ability to stand her ground. She had the ability to fight. And even when people told her not to exit the marriage, that owning that land gave her so much confidence and so much conviction to actually help herself and lift herself out of that situation. So for me, when you say this, it's very personal. It's extremely personal that land is an asset that gives women so much of worth and confidence and safety and security. But for me, I grew up seeing women own land. My mother owned inherited land from her mother and her father independently, separately, and she managed her land. And in my family, I've been raised seeing women inherit and own and operate their lands independently. However, I'm aware that this is not the norm. This is, I mean, I come from a matrilineal community, so this is a norm in my community. But across India, this is not the norm, and the norm largely is of women not owning property or not owning land, right? And I imagine this has been even more stricter. It has been even more, the approach and attitude was even more conservative and rigid 20 years ago when you started your career. So I'm very curious to know, how did you arrive at this intersection of land rights and women?
So, Rekha, that's an interesting question. 20 years back when I began working, I never imagined that one day I would be working on land rights. But by degree, I am an agriculture graduate, so that gives me some connection to agriculture. But when I started working in rural development and I started working with women and became familiar with the gender discourses in India and elsewhere, I
Mm,
kind of knew that this is the place where I belonged
mm,
to the women's rights space. I knew that this is what I want to be working for. And
mm,
when I worked gradually with women farmers and for their livelihoods, I realized how women farmers' labor in agriculture is invisibilized since
yeah.
they do not own land, they are not recognized as farmers, and thus remain marginalized throughout the agriculture value chain when they are not recognized as farmers in our head, in our policies, in our institutions. So the policies that we design are by default to cater to men farmers. The extension system that works, government extension system or a private company's extension system. It all caters to men's needs, men's priorities, and
Yeah.
men's concerns. So it
Yeah.
just outrightly marginalizes women farmers. And
Yeah.
as I interact with women around me in rural areas as well as in urban areas, I hear how deeply they wish they could have independent access over land. So I
Mm,
and also at the same time, on the one side I see these aspirations of women both young and old to own land independently, but at
mm,
the same time I see there is a huge gap
mm,
The organizations that are working on women's rights, as you said in the beginning, are only working on the addressing land rights issue kind of tangentially.
yeah,
And those who are working on land issues are also not talking enough about land rights of women. So there is a huge gap which I kind of identified. So
yeah,
this and there also is a gap between what legal rights ought to be, what are the legal rights in the language of the law, and then
mm,
what we perceive our rights are and what we get in practice. So
yeah.
all these gaps are the kind of things which motivate me or keep me consistently working on land rights at several places.
Shipra, having spoken to you so many times over the past many weeks, I will say that I'm only very grateful that somebody as passionate about like you is actually working on the ground on this, because I think in an area when there isn't so much of focus, when there is a topic like land rights and women and there isn't much focus on this intersection, we need extremely passionate voices. But tell me, what have you seen, observed, and understood about the social and cultural norms surrounding a woman's right to own land?
So culturally and socially, Rekha, I have always seen, ever since I have started working, I have seen a strong patriarchal hold over land. So, whenever I have had conversations with people about women's rights, be it in rural areas, urban areas, or
Yeah,
people working in the government or community leaders in the village, it's when you talk about women's rights, it's easy to have conversations around health rights,
yeah,
around education, and as you said, around microfinance, financial literacy,
right,
entrepreneurship, things like that. But as soon as you start talking about ownership of land, there
yeah,
is a huge resistance. Why
yeah,
should women? There is a huge resistance, there is huge skepticism.
mm,
So, culturally and socially, I think it's because we have always seen family as a unit
mm,
and men as the head of that household.
mm,
And
right,
we tend to believe that everyone's interest in the household are congruent
yeah,
and aligned.
yeah,
So, but what happens actually is when household dissolves, and beyond this typical definition of a heterosexual household,
yeah,
there are independent interests of family members which are not aligned in just any way. It
yeah,
actually does matter significantly whose name is on the land title, who is
yes,
the legal holder, and
yes,
who has the right to do what out of that land. I mean, it's not just about having the name on the title
yeah,
paper, but also about who can sell, who can use, who
yeah,
has the right to occupy, and things like that. So
right,
we culturally we tend to ignore women's identity, independent identity, to the
yeah,
extent that you would be surprised, Rekha, to know that for ages, for years together, the land records that we have in India and in several other countries, we do not we do not mention the sex of the landholder, of the title holder. So as
mm,
a result, we
yeah,
can never know. It's become difficult to know actually how much land parcels do women in India own, or conversely, like how many women, what percentage of women do own land. So that data itself becomes difficult to assess, but micro studies have shown that it's like 4% to 14% at the
mm,
maximum. So this huge gap is like widely visible. And when we talk of, you are talking about the cultural context. I'll give you an example from the state in UP.
yes,
So a few years ago, there began a conversations about joint titles for women. So whenever uh, state governments, some of the state governments have this ruling that when state allocates land to landless people in their
mm,
particular state, the titles which are issued need to be in joint names.
Hmm.
Now, when you and I hear this, we would understand the joint titles means the husband and wife would be the joint owner of that land.
Yeah.
And we would expect the law and the language to express it that way only. But I
Right.
was so surprised, so shocked when I read this UP law, and the language of the law said that whenever a piece of land will be allocated to a man, and
Yeah.
if the man happens to be married, the name of his wife will also be included.
Okay.
So they talked of the woman just as the appendage and not really as the equal title holder. Same is
Right.
Maharashtra law
Yeah.
as well. So, what is
Right.
this? So, this essentially is something deep that tells the laws and policy makers that women are not the prime landholder.
Right.
They just
Right.
can be. So, it for sure there is a strong patriarchal sense which is
Yeah.
working behind them. This patriarchy, which is deeply expressed in stereotypes, attitudes, perceptions,
Yeah.
and norms, and
Yeah.
those norms which run from family to institutions to
Yeah.
revenue offices to administration to governance and where not everywhere. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
so that is the context.
That's very interesting because I mentioned that I come from a matrilineal family structure, but it's very interesting that, and this is where a lot of people make a mistake about matrilineal structure. They think the women are strong and the women are powerful, but what a lot of people don't know is that in a matrilineal structure, the head of the family is still a man. It's still a patriarch. Women
Yeah.
have voices, but it's a patriarch, and
Yes.
to even if you own land, to operate that land, to manage that land, you come across a lot of resistance if what you want to do with your land is not aligned with what the men in your life or the rest of the family thinks is right in the larger scheme of things. So it what we talk about, the systemic bias, it's everywhere. It creeps into the laws, into the enforcement. And but I'm very curious, what have you observed about this systemic bias from the perspective of women? How has this shaped the beliefs and thoughts of women themselves when it comes to land rights or property, the right to own land or property?
So I think Rekha, women grow up listening that land doesn't belong to them. So
Yeah.
they themselves do not see that connect. When they are born in a family, so look at an example of a boy and a girl born in the same family. So
Right.
the boy, everyone considers the boy to be the rightful heir of the family property,
Yeah.
family lineage, family name, and everything.
Yeah.
While a daughter, she grows up hearing that this home where she was born and where she is being raised with her brothers is
Yeah.
not actually her true home, and that she instead belongs to her future marital home. She
Yeah.
grows up listening how her parents are thinking about the dowry that they will have to one day give in her marriage, and how they are worried about it.
Yeah.
So when she grows up listening this, and at the same time there is this boy, her brother, who is growing up listening that he everything belongs to him.
Yeah.
He is the rightful owner of the property, of the lineage, of everything.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
you would be surprised to know, like, these inheritance rights for men are unchangeable. They are like same in Hindu religion, in Muslim religion, in tribal communities, except for just a few matrilineal communities, as you mentioned. But the rights of the boys are similar, and they remain same throughout their life cycle. They do
Yeah.
not change. They
Yeah.
have that. Their rights are indisputable. But what
Yeah.
happens for a girl?
Yeah.
It depend on a lot of external factors. Like when she
Yeah.
is born, her rights will depend on whether she is born in a Hindu family or in a Muslim family or in a Christian family or in a tribal family. So
Yeah.
it depends on religion, it depends on caste. In several states, there also are like state specific agriculture laws for agricultural land. So
Yeah.
in those cases, it depends on whether it will vary if she is born in Uttar Pradesh or if she is born in Tamil Nadu or Andhra Pradesh or
Yeah.
West Bengal. And her rights also change with whether she is unmarried or when she gets
Yeah.
married or when she becomes a widow or if she takes a divorce or if she does a
Yeah.
second marriage. So all of these things, but a male's rights, they remain undisputed
Yeah.
all through these life phases. So what happens is, because of an absence of this right, daughters are stripped of an important opportunity to build their lives. If
Yeah.
you have land, you can build a room to live in, you can start an enterprise of your own,
Yeah.
agricultural or non-agricultural. You can lease it out, you can use it as a collateral in the
Yeah.
bank. So deprivation of this one opportunity, it tells daughters that they are lesser beings, that they deserve less, and that they must be satisfied with less. And at the same time, boys grow up with this privilege and honor of having, guaranteed and full rights to land and property. And this gap of entitlement and authority, in a lot of cases I have seen, it breeds violence at a huge gap. I met
Mm.
this woman in Punjab who was a professor in a university in Punjab, and she told me that when she demanded her, after her parents' death, when she demanded her brother that she be given her due right on the parents' property,
Mm.
her brother asked her to come to sleep with him and have sex, and that would allow her to become a member of, that lineage, that their own family. So that's only when you can assert. So such is the kind of this of the violence that women have to face when they assert their rights. It's just one example, but
Yeah.
I have been listening to women all across the country, and they all have like different stories to share. To
Yeah.
me, I mean, the most shameful in this is that daughters are pushed to this harm by their own immediate families and by their own communities with their
Yeah.
full knowledge and with their full
Yeah.
consent. So the
Yeah.
families, which are supposed to be the safe heaven for girls, they become hostile and intimidating when daughters start asserting their rights.
Yeah. Also what is coming to me when you say this is this whole aspect of self-worth. There is so much conversation in the mainstream about women not having a high sense of self-worth, women constantly looking for validation from each other, but we don't really look at the underlying root that when you are raised with a sense of lesser, and that is in a very monetary sense, or whether you can own high value assets or not, whether you belong to that land you've been born on or not. How do your basic foundations for your identity and your sense of self-worth itself is damaged right from the
Right.
time you're born on account of gender, right? So we have Miranda who has said if it comes down to the brass tacks, everything is controlled by patriarchy, filling in any simple paper, digital form, asking for husband's name, father's name, or grandfather's name, etc. Daughters are raised believing they live in temporary homes in comparison to sons. And I think what you say about this not belonging to your own home or to your own land is striking a chord with quite a few people who are listening in right now. But tell me, you also mentioned something about dowry, right? That girls grow up thinking that grow up hearing their parents talk about dowry. Now, the dowry is something that is, we talk against it, but it is a very harsh reality of our times. And I know of instances where in casual conversations I have heard women being told that, but in your dowry and your wedding our parents gave you this, and therefore you have no further rights in the family property. I know that there are communities where it is believed that once a daughter's share is handed over to her in the form of a dowry, she has no further claim. Have you come across this, and have you seen women buy into this notion that because they've been married off with a dowry, that they may or may not manage, operate, or actually own, that they have no rights on their parental property.
Yeah. So, Rekha, there are two things. One is when we say dowry, then daughters also grow up in the same patriarchal atmosphere. They grow up listening that, they are to receive dowry. They grow up listening that dowry is what they will get. They never listen that, they will get right on property. So, in many cases, what I have seen is that if daughter are not daughters are not receiving dowry, they are not getting anything. So
Yeah,
it's because they are not getting rights anyway, the inheritance
yeah,
right. So
yeah,
whatever they are getting is in the form of dowry. Now it's a different question altogether, that even when dowry is it's said that dowry is given to daughters, they never get it to control by themselves, because it's usually consumed and controlled only by the in-laws family, and very
yeah,
very rarely by daughters themselves. So I think in those situations, it's only normal for daughters to think that dowry belongs to them.
yeah,
That is one. And see, we have this Dowry Prohibition Act made, I think, in 1961. It
mm,
was 1961 when we had this Dowry Prohibition Act. But
mm,
since then, it's been like, so many years, but it's continuing unabated. And once I was so surprised that a few years ago, in my own circle of friends, like
yeah,
all urban educated working friends, and uh, they were surprised at just the idea of getting daughters married without dowry. They were like, how is it possible? And I
yeah,
was like, these are educated urban men, and they are not able to think that it's possible. It's
yeah,
unthinkable, unimaginable to them. So
yeah,
that's what culture does to us. Dowry looks like the normal,
yeah,
natural thing. It's part of the marriage ritual. Same is
yeah,
true with kanyadan. So all these things, when they
yeah,
come together,
yeah,
uh, they make a frame that dowry is essential. But otherwise, dowry is purely from the legal perspective as well.
yeah.
Dowry is illegal, and inheritance is like the right given by law. So
Absolutely,
there's
absolutely. And I think also what's interesting is a lot of time the dowry doesn't always prove to be a high value asset that is appreciating over time, right? Like for instance, if you get land, it appreciates over time, right? But
exactly
or, but even a car that's given to the groom is a part of dowry. How does that
right.
depreciate year on year? You don't get to drive it, or you're not the owner of it. So how, I think this whole concept of dowry uh, and squaring dowry off with inheritance rights is somewhere I think we've got it wrong. So Miranda's weighed in again saying the famous defense that comes with dowry by parents, yes, you are now married off, it's all done, that's your share. And if we do decide to give you land, that's our decision. But in no way should you even dream of receiving from us the same amount of land as your brothers, as you do not carry forward the father's family name. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Miranda, thanks for sharing that. That's really, really powerful. Thank you for sharing
Yes.
that. Uh,
Carrying the family name, and also granting son only the rights to do the find the death rituals of parents. I think all of these things together hold to keep women,
yeah.
distanced from land rights.
Yeah, absolutely. So, tell me something. Have you observed people being challenged by the fact that if a daughter has a right in her parental property, that she may be getting double share of, she may be inheriting land or high value property in two places, in her parental, from her parental and her marital home. Do you find people being challenged by that?
That's an absolute myth, Rekha.
Hmm.
Daughters, women don't get it anywhere. It's just a myth that they get it from both the places. And this is how I think this is patriarchy's trick to outrightly reject women's rights. And
Yeah.
otherwise, from a legal perspective,
Hmm.
in the kind of legal framework that we have in India,
Hmm.
uh, uh, a daughter has rights in parents' property and land, but
Hmm.
she doesn't have a right in her marital home. In
Yeah.
her marital home, she gets a right only when she becomes a widow from a legal perspective. But the
Hmm.
moment you become a part of your marital family, you don't become the right holder. You don't get your names listed in the family legacy like sons names get enlisted that the moment they are born. No,
Yeah.
daughter-in-laws do not get it that way. So they receive land as right only when they become a widow. So it's a complete myth that they
Yeah.
get both the places. Though it's like equally common, people, these two things are the most common things, and I'm glad you have raised both these points that we have given dowry, so why should we give the rights, and that daughter will get it in both the places.
Yeah, right. So, tell me something, Shipra. For many women, right, the very right to own land and the very right to own property and to operate it and to, to manage it and to use it, it's a concept that is, to quote your words, very distant for them. It's not something that is very natural. A lot, even, even women who own land struggle with independently managing it. There's always this tendency to lean into the father or the brother or the husband or somebody, that you always tend to need it, right? You don't see this in men. Why do you think women struggle so much with the with just, embracing this idea of owning high value assets like land and property, and more than that, in exercising this right?
So I think, just because of this entire notion that women do not have independent rights over land, right from the beginning, when they grow up, they are not made part of land conversations. So
Hmm.
it's rare for daughters to know how much, or even in the marital families. I
Yeah.
meet a lot of women, and since they also have this notion in their head that land is something which they do not have a connect with, land doesn't belong to them, so they are not aware about where do families have the land,
Yeah.
where are the papers related to land, whose
Yeah.
name is there on the papers and things like that. So just
Right.
because in their head they are like distanced from this connection, plus they also many a times do not have information about you know where to go and how to manage land and things like that. And then if you look at from a rural perspective, if you look at the revenue offices and the administrative offices that manage land concerns, they are all very patriarchal. If you walk in a revenue office in UP, you will see all men flocked together.
Yeah.
If you have gone ever to these kinds of places, it's a
Yeah.
bit different in southern India, but in UP and in West Bengal and in several other states, it's that same. So because of all that patriarchal holds there in these spaces, in this conversation, and this intentional distance that at which women are kept at, so I
Hmm.
think all of these work together. Otherwise, in my experience, wherever we give women opportunities, they have, outperformed. They have done wonders, whether it's about managing land or whether it's about managing their lives in any way.
Yeah, something that strikes me as we are having this conversation is it's almost as if uh, where we have this patriarchy as a system, right? Where we have groups of men who are upholding patriarchal values and the patriarchal thinking, there is such deep resistance to a woman occupying land or occupying space, right? And I mean, when you were talking to me, the what came to my mind is, as a single woman, I often am renting spaces for myself. And I think I mentioned this to you in one of our conversations, that one of the questions I often get from people is, why does a single woman have to rent a whole house? Why do you need the space? And it's almost like you're being asked to justify, why do you want land to occupy? It's not even whether you can, afford to pay your rent, or whether it's the your right to occupy is often questioned over there. And I think that's what's coming across. So Miranda has a question. She says, I'm curious to know whether research has shown that inherited land for sons create problems too. For example, such as sons who don't invest in future ambitious studies or jobs for financial security, or rushing their passions as it is ingrained in them that they will inherit lots of land and not much else is needed, whereas daughters who have no land plan to fall back on instead invest in studies and professions for security. What do you think?
That's a very specific thing to research for, but I think one thing which people generally say in response to women's right to own is that women go to distant places after marriage and it becomes difficult for them to manage, and that's why they should not have land. But we do not use the same kind of argument for men.
Yeah,
Even as like men leave their homelands and they go to distant places all around the world to
yeah,
earn and to live their lives, their rights in their native places remain secure. They can come back and ask their share
yeah,
anyway. But
yeah,
and whatever they might do of that land. But the
yeah.
same is not true for daughters. Even if she wants to invest in her professional studies or anything, it's not seen her right.
Yeah, and I think there's also a cost to it because when we talk about the right to, to own land or property, this is not a rural phenomenon. This is not just agricultural land. This is a pan-India problem, urban and rural. And we see one of the biggest costs that women pay for being disconnected and dissociated from land is the fact that they often end up in problematic, they end up with mortgages that they weren't ready for. They end up being signatories or sureties, collateral sureties, and taking on the financial liabilities of their male partners, brother, whoever else it is, because they're so disconnected, they haven't done the homework. They haven't really equipped themselves for it, right? Have
Right.
you observed any of this? Any such costs that women have paid in terms of land ownership, where the distance has caused problems for them like this?
For maintenance of land. I mean, if women are living at distant places.
No, not distant places. Like, for instance, I own a property, but
Mhm.
because I am not equipped, or I am, there's a distance between me and this idea of owning
Okay,
property.
okay. Yeah.
I'm letting somebody else manage my property, and that can get me into trouble at some point in time because I may have debt. I may lose that property because I've signed a power of attorney. There are risks. There are high risks to that, right?
Exactly. There are. I mean, so there, of course, are also instances which I have seen where women have to endure violence
Yeah.
also because they own land. One is
Okay.
that violence because I remember this old woman who owned land, and her son was pressurizing her to sell off this land and to give it to her, but she
Yeah.
was a widow and she was like, no, I will not give it to you. And then the son like shot her mother. He
Wow.
killed her mother.
Mm.
So those instances are also
Yeah.
around. I mean, so the root cause is obviously the patriarchy, and then
Yeah.
the worst of a form of the violence which is inflicted on women,
Mm.
especially in relation to land, is something which I saw in Jharkhand and in some of the tribal communities,
Mm.
where it's a bit common to declare women as witches, and
Mm.
several studies in India have found that wherever women are declared as witches, in most of the cases, these are the women who are single and who had some ownership of land.
Mm.
So when they were in a vulnerable life positions, for example, if she becomes
Yeah.
a widow, so
Yeah.
what's there in these tribal communities, especially the ones that I studied in Jharkhand, but I know it's similar in several other states as
Yeah.
well and in several
Yeah.
other communities as well,
Yeah.
that women do not have like full rights. As even as a widow,
Yeah.
women do not have full rights on land. So what
Yeah.
happens is if a woman becomes a widow, her husband passes away,
Yeah.
the rightful heir of the land is her brother-in-law or her son. And
Mm.
as a widow woman only has the right to be maintained out of that land, which
Mm.
means that her expenses related to
Mm.
fooding and living would
Yeah.
be fulfilled and
Yeah.
out of that land. So what
Yeah.
happens is these men who I call the owner in waiting,
Yeah.
they really see these women as an obstacle in their full rights, and they
Yeah.
want to remove those women from their path as soon as possible. And
Yeah.
that is when all kinds of violence,
Yeah.
physical, mental, all kinds of violence is inflicted on them, just
Yeah.
to throw them out of the families. They want those women to just leave their families in any case.
Yeah.
So that's the most brutal form of violence that I have seen and researched.
My goodness. It's actually really heartbreaking at a certain level to know that just on account of your gender, the right to own land makes you vulnerable as much as it grants you safety, right?
Right, right.
So Miranda says it's also interesting to see how public spaces in connection to land purchase and other processes are not women friendly, like land offices. I think that you mentioned a little bit earlier. And Precious says even in Africa, as a woman, it's difficult to acquire one. So I think we're talking about a problem that affects women not just in India but across a multiple geography
Yes.
spectrum, right? But
Yeah.
I want to now kind of shift focus to what is actually happening on the ground. I do remember that, in one of your articles, you wrote about how land ownership is crucial for women to be safe and empowered. So, how do you see things changing on the ground?
So, as I said earlier, I mean, land rights give women an opportunity to build their lives and the courage to move out of violent relationships.
Mm,
So, wherever women are given opportunities and safe spaces to claim their land,
mm,
they aspire to claim lands. And when it comes to using land to build their own lives, they
yeah,
really surpass the expectations. So
yeah,
in West Bengal, I know of several women who come together as a self-help group, and they kind of collectively leased in land to
mm,
cultivate that land for themselves and
mm, mm,
grow vegetables. So initially, people were a lot skeptic if women would be able to do farming collectively on this land on their own. But then, when women got the chance, they could sign lease agreements with the landowners. They could
yeah,
negotiate with a lot of stakeholders, such as seed suppliers or insecticide suppliers, etc., to get information and to use those things on their farm. They could also harvest and market that and make gains and make profits out of it. And similarly, Landesa does a lot of such kind of a work where we promote women's land rights in collaboration with the government. In one of our program in Odisha, we institutionalized again with the government
mm,
several women support centers in a few districts, and these women support centers were mandated to identify single women in those districts and then
mm,
allocate plots of land to them. So that's where state really shown a great interest. Similarly, in the state of UP and in West Bengal, we have provided land literacy session to more than 6 lakh women so far.
mhm,
And
mm,
these all women are networked through self-help groups, and they are provided literacy sessions through the government mechanism. So government departments play a major role in imparting these literacy sessions. And I remember how when we were doing literacy sessions in UP, and one of the local revenue office came to our staff and told them that what are you doing these days? A lot of women are coming to our office to inquire about their land related issues. So
yeah,
because women really find it very empowering. Just the
mm,
idea that they can own land,
yeah,
and when they get the information that where can they visit and where they can see and see their land titles, etc., they become really curious and want to visit those places and see. And one of the most encouraging examples is from something that we are doing in West Bengal. After the land literacy sessions that we conducted in West Bengal, a lot of women really got interested, and government officials were also encouraged, seeing women's interest in capacity to absorb information related to land.
yeah,
So, so together with the government, we designed a program
mm,
where we trained a few select women
mm,
on updating land records
mm,
digitally. So
mm,
we provided those trainings to a few select women in the first phase. And what
mm,
happened was these women, they learned to operate computers and update land records on the computers on
mm,
the government website and platform.
yeah,
And gradually they started it as an enterprise in their village and in their area. Today,
mm,
these women are offering land record updation services and other land based advisory services on a payment basis. So it's
wow,
like an enterprise. So initially, we began it in just one district with six such centers, but recently government has showed their consent and interest to replicate it in several other districts in West Bengal. And I think that's really so encouraging, seeing women come into land record updation, something which has, for always been a male dominant space. Women
yeah,
providing those technical land services is
yeah,
something
yeah.
really which is breaking the gender norms.
No, I think what you say is very right because when we speak of a woman walking into a space to update, her land records or do any transaction with land, something we don't recognize is how much it takes for that woman to walk into that space, which is extremely patriarchal, and to then stand up for her right. And it may seem very small and simple when we're talking about it, but in action, it's a huge win for that woman who's doing it. And just for women to come together and support each other and actually streamline the process, I think that's brilliant. So tell me, Shipra, what are the macro and micro changes that we need to see further to see women confidently claim and assert their right to own land and property?
So here I do think, Rekha, that there is a need to normalize women's ownership of land,
Mm,
especially their inheritance in natal families, because that's where women have the legal right in our country.
yeah,
And it's how ugly it is that women have to struggle for their rights within their own families, with their fathers, mothers, brothers, the people that they love. And then so that's one thing which I really need change. And then those responsible for implementation of existing laws, they
mm,
also need to be sensitized, the government officials and the elected leaders in rural communities, the panchayat leaders, etc. And
mm.
then in several other contexts, laws themselves also need to be reformed and reframed.
Yeah, yeah, sorry.
There are several land laws which were framed in the British era from that perspective, and
Mm,
there haven't been much changes since then. So
mm,
there is a need to revisit those laws and bring about the changes there.
mm,
But
mm.
then otherwise, I also think that there are a lot of things that can be done, of course. I mean, the entire revenue department that manages land related affairs is so patriarchal. So there is a
Yeah.
need to engender this specific department so that there are more women at least.
Right, absolutely. So tell me, what do women need to know about their rights? Like we know that, yeah, women do have rights to own land, but what are the must know things that every woman should know when it comes to land rights or property ownership rights?
they should know that they have the right, and they should know that they can assert it. And I
Hmm.
think, th- even when we theoretically know that we have rights, we do not tell this to our subconscious mind. The
Hmm.
other day, just I mean, last month, I think I was speaking to an to some NGO workers working on ground, and these were all a group of women that were working on several legal cases. And I told them that when you go to your parents' home, you are, most of them were married women. What's the feeling with which you go? Do you
Hmm.
think you are going there as a guest, or do you go there as a right, telling yourself with the same assertion and
Yeah.
power with which your brother lives there? I mean,
Right.
in words, it's easy to say I have the right there, but am I telling my subconscious mind that,
Yeah.
or am
Yeah.
I going there just as a submissive kind of a person? And they were all like, yes, this is something that we need to do.
Yeah.
And then when you are talking to your daughters, what are you telling them? Are you
Yeah.
telling them that they will go one day to their marital home? Or are you repeatedly telling them that no, when people are telling her that this is not your home, but you are repeatedly telling them that no, don't listen to them, this is your home.
Yeah.
And no matter what, you have your rights secured here. You should feel safe here. Are we telling this to our daughters?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think asserting rights is really important. I mean, and when we know our rights, I know that it's easier said than done, and
Yeah.
assertion has its own challenges. It's difficult, but when we assert, know that you are asserting your rights not only for yourself, it's
Yeah.
for a lot other women around you, lot
Yes.
other women who are coming next to you. So I
Right.
think. Assertion is really important, first within yourself and then outside yourself.
Yeah. Now, I think what you, particularly the point you make about what are we telling our daughters, I think that is very, very critical and crucial because whether we like it or not in our country, we still have women who are dying in their marital homes. We still have women who don't have safe spaces. We still have lots of women who are trapped in extremely violent marriages. As somebody who has undergone a lot of abuse in my own life, I know one thing that all the time, there's one thing my mother's always told me, and there's one thing that has been an absolute truth in my life, that I belong in my home. The home is the land I was born on. That's the land my mother inherited from her ancestors. That's my land. So, even if my mother and I fight, and she said, "This is my house." I say, "No, I have a right to be here because this
Exactly.
is the land of my ancestors and I belong here. You cannot take it away from me." And being able to articulate that and being experiencing it fully, I think that's one of the most empowering things that can, it's like you will, as long as you have a place to call home and that you have a place that's yours, you will always be able to rise from whatever it is that has challenged you or has given you, taken you down. So Miranda has a question. She says, "Is there much progress in comparison to the past? For example, in the late 90s, it was so difficult for single women and single women with children to rent apartments. I've heard it's still difficult to do it in comparison to men."
Yeah, I do understand that these challenges continue to be there, and I think the only way is to keep, bombarding these challenges with our assertions. So the more single women we see in the spaces seeking out for renting apartments, the lesser the challenges will be.
Yeah, yeah,
So, sitting back in your homes is not the answer, but just asserting whatever you want them.
yeah, yeah.
That is the answer.
Actually, as a single woman, I'm going to weigh in on this, Miranda. I do believe there are changes because I think 20 years ago, when I started my career, it was almost impossible to rent an apartment on my own. I had to have roommates to be able to find an affordable apartment. It's difficult still. The minute somebody sees a single woman, yes, there are questions asked. The rents miraculously double and triple. You have landlords who are acting funny because they think you're vulnerable. But the good thing is, there also are people who are kind and compassionate, who are from our generation, who are owning houses and, renting it out, and who are a little more progressive than, say, those who were here 20 years ago. So I think the change is there, as Shipra says, as they see more single women around, as they see more single women renting apartments, the change is happening. And I think the only way is for us to keep at it, right? I don't think there's any backing off. And she has another question. She says, can women demand equal distribution of land in their
Equal
inheritance, their
distribution of land in a family. So, I mean, that's what I said. I mean, it all depends on a lot of context. So, in Hindu, because uh, inheritance of land in our country is governed by religious laws. So there are different laws that govern Hindu families, Hindu daughters, and Muslim daughters, and Christian daughters. But in Hindu families and in Christian families, daughters now have equal rights at the first instance. I mean, there are some disparities, some as you go down the deeper and the complicated situations, but in the general sense, daughters do have right, and they can demand the partition of the traditional joint family land,
yeah,
and they can also demand equal rights. Rather, they have that right. So tell yourself that you have that right, and you only need to get that. So
yeah,
it is there, and a lot of women, this generation of women, they know their rights, and I see a lot of women getting assertive, however difficult it is, but women are getting assertive. You know,
yeah,
a change
yeah.
is happening, however slow it is. Yeah.
And I think the good thing also is we now have more women lawyers who are also very, very invested
Right.
in supporting women in their, in ensuring that their rights are met. So I think when it comes to property rights, I think one of the best things a woman can do is actually have a lawyer who is going to help her understand and navigate the context of it as well. So just knowing what you can do and then standing up for it can be a big game changer for us all, right?
Yes, yes.
So
And over the last few years, I think Supreme Court of India has really set up precedents
yeah,
by giving some of the very progressive judgments.
yeah,
So Supreme Court in several cases has asserted that daughters have rights
yeah,
wherever they are and whatever it is, and that is the intent of the central government, because central government is also, as a nation, we have signed several conventions like
yeah,
CEDAW and also the SDGs, etc. So we need to comply to them. So we need
right,
to have those progressive laws in place, and those progressive laws certainly are helping
yeah,
the women of the nation.
yeah. Anyway, I think we've come to almost the top of the hour. So we have a few minutes in case anybody has any last questions as while we are winding up. But Chipra, any last questions, any last words for our audience? Uh,
So the last word I think will only be that, land is such a powerful tool, and we need to recognize that, and I will encourage women to assert it wherever they can.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, Shipra. Thank you so much for this really fascinating conversation. I want to thank everybody who's joined in. Miranda, thank you so much for all those questions and comments and your active participation. Precious, thank you for weighing in all the way from Africa. To everybody else who's been watching us, thank you very much. We are extremely grateful that you have joined us because I was a little unsure of what I was going to open this live to this today. We have received a certain amount of pushback to this topic already, and Shipra and I were laughing before we came on, saying, "Let's see what happens as we go forward." We are very, very delighted and grateful to see such enthusiastic participation, such open sharing, such open conversation. Shipra, once again, thank you so much. And if you find Shipra's content interesting, if you are interested in the work that Shipra does, please know she's available on LinkedIn. She blogs regularly on the Landesa blog. Shipra, is there any other space where people can read your writing or your thoughts or the content that you're putting out?
So I am very less on social media. It's only on LinkedIn that I kind of post what I read and whatever I like. So
Right,
I'm only there in social
right.
media.
Well, you can follow Shipra's work on social media.
Online.
Yeah, in fact, Shipra and I connected on LinkedIn, and we built up a friendship through our conversations via LinkedIn. So, if you find what she has said interesting and you're interested in knowing more of her work, please do reach out to her on LinkedIn, follow her work, support her work. We need to extend our support to everybody who's working in this very important area. With that, I'm going to say thank you to everybody for joining us for this week's edition of Conversation from the Trenches.